In the warm dimness of an old stone chamber, a painted eye still watches from the wall. It is only pigment, only mineral and time, and yet it seems to hold its place with complete patience. The desert outside is quiet. The river is far away. And somewhere between them, in the long, soft distance of centuries, the gods of ancient Egypt still rest in their names, their symbols, and the careful hands that carved them. This is a slow place to spend an evening. There are temples with columns like rows of sleeping trees. There are tombs tucked into cliffs. There are small carved figures, folded linen wrappings, bowls left as offerings, and prayers written in ink that has faded to the color of dust. Ancient Egyptian myths are often described as grand and powerful, and they were, but they were also intimate. They lived in household shrines, in amulets, in painted coffins, and in the quiet habits of daily life. So tonight, we can wander gently through that world, not in a hurry, not to solve anything, only to notice. We can follow the Nile at an unhurried pace, pause near a temple doorway, and listen for the soft traces of stories that were once told beside water and flame. Ancient Egypt was never one single fixed story. It lasted for thousands of years, and across those long centuries, beliefs changed in small ways, as river levels shifted, as kings rose and disappeared, as cities grew, as writing developed, as new forms of art appeared on stone. What people called the gods could sound familiar in one era and slightly different in another. A deity might be local to one town, then slowly become known across a wider land. Sometimes gods merged with each other in gentle layers, as if time itself had been blending colors. That is one of the quiet fascinations of Egyptian mythology. It does not stand still. It accumulates. It keeps old versions beside newer ones. It allows one god to have many names, many faces, many duties. The sky could be a goddess. The sun could travel as a living presence. The earth could be imagined as a body. The river could feel almost like a promise made visible. And because Egypt was so closely tied to the Nile, the myths often seem to breathe with rhythm. The river rises and falls. Fields become green, then dry. Life seems to return, then retreat. In such a world, stories about death and rebirth feel less like abstractions and more like the natural language of existence. A seed goes into the earth. A star disappears. A body is wrapped carefully for the next world. The same landscape teaches both endings and returns. One of the most familiar figures is Ra, or Re, the sun god, whose daily movement across the sky was understood as a journey. The sun did not simply shine. In the old imagination, it traveled. It crossed the heavens by day and passed through the underworld by night. That idea gave the sky a shape and gave darkness its own geography. Night was not empty. It was a road. And so evening itself can feel ancient here. You can imagine a boat moving beneath stars, the oars low in the water, the deck lit by a quiet glow. The sun god's passage through the night was often linked with challenge, but in a bedtime story it can simply feel steady, repetitive, reassuring. Another dawn comes. The light returns. The world keeps its measure. The Egyptian gods were not always gentle, of course. Some were fierce. Some were guardians of order. Some stood near death or storms or the strange borders between one form of life and another. But even the stronger images can be held at a distance tonight, softened by the fact that they were part of a broader understanding of balance. The old Egyptian world often imagined existence as something that needed tending. Order had to be preserved. Chaos existed, but so did the work of arranging, measuring, naming, offering, and remembering. That sense of care appears again and again. Tombs were prepared with thought. Walls were painted with scenes of food, boats, birds, and family life. Statues were placed so that a spirit might have somewhere to rest. Texts were written to help the dead travel, to protect them, to remind them of names and passages. The afterlife was not a vague dream. It was organized, and in that organization there is something almost comforting. A path, however symbolic, is still a path. The names of the afterlife texts themselves sound like quiet documents from a distant shelf. Coffin texts, pyramid texts, Book of the Dead. Each one is part scripture, part charm, part guidebook, part memory. They do not always read like a single story. They feel more like a collection of doorways. One line opens into another. One image follows a bird, or a stair, or a riverbank in the dark. Ancient readers may have known many of these words by heart, or heard them spoken aloud during burial rituals. Others may have simply trusted the images, the symbols, the repetition. The Book of the Dead, despite its modern title, was not one fixed book in the way we might imagine a book now. It was a set of spells and passages, chosen and arranged in different ways for different people. Some copies were elegant and richly painted. Others were more modest. The idea itself is beautiful in a quiet way. Each person's journey could be accompanied by familiar words, tailored to their circumstances, like a lantern carried into a long hall. A great deal of Egyptian religion was practical in that sense. It was not only about distant gods in the abstract. It was about protection, timing, naming, fitting together the visible and invisible parts of life. A carved amulet could be worn for safety. A prayer could be spoken before a journey. A temple could serve as a meeting place between human need and divine presence. In this world, the sacred was not far away. It lived near doorways and on necklaces and inside carefully painted coffins. Sometimes the gods are remembered by the objects they left behind. The Eye of Horus, for example, is one of the most enduring symbols from ancient Egypt. It appears on amulets, in art on walls, and in later interpretations. The eye itself suggests watchfulness, healing, wholeness, and protection. In a modern room, it may look decorative, but in the old world, it carried a sense of being guarded by something larger than oneself. Even now, it has a calm, balanced shape. It feels almost like a sign that rest can be safe. Horus himself is often linked with kingship and the sky, and like many Egyptian gods, he appears in several forms across time. In some stories, he is a falcon. In others, he is a child. In still others, he stands for legitimacy, continuity, and the proper order of rule. The pharaoh was often connected with Horus, which meant that kingship was not just political. It was cosmic. The ruler was part of the shape of the world. That may sound grand, but in the long view of Egyptian history, it also meant that kingship was saturated with ritual detail. Crowns mattered. Scepters mattered. Seals mattered. The act of presenting offerings mattered. Even the arrangement of a name on a monument could carry spiritual weight. Every visible thing could point beyond itself. And yet, for all the scale of pyramids and temples, there is something deeply human in the surviving material. The Egyptians wrote letters. They counted grain. They labeled jars. They kept accounts. They remembered birthdays, marriages, family ties. In some places, workmen left graffiti that still survives, as if a brief joke or signature could travel across millennia. The old civilization can feel monumental, but it was also made of ordinary days. There is a particular comfort in that. A people who built vast tombs also worried about bread and work and illness and the correct words for prayers. The myths were not detached from the mundane. They helped organize it. A story about a god could explain why the sun rises. A ritual could help with grief. A symbol could guard a child. A hymn could make a room feel less lonely. One of the gentlest qualities of ancient Egyptian religion is how often it returns to order after disruption. A myth may describe a dangerous force, a wound, a scattering, a loss. Then comes restoration. Then comes naming. Then comes the rejoining of pieces. This pattern appears in stories of Osiris, for example, whose death and return became deeply important in later thought about fertility, kingship, and the cycle of life. Osiris is one of those figures who seems to gather meanings around him. He is linked with the dead, but also with renewal. He is a ruler, but also a presence in the underworld. He becomes a symbol of what is lost and what endures. The story of his body being divided and carefully gathered again is not a story to rush through. It is a story of patient attention, of recomposition, of the belief that what is broken may still be honored. And there is Isis, too, whose role is often remembered as protective, magical, searching, and devoted. In many retellings, she becomes a figure of wisdom and healing. She gathers. She speaks the hidden names. She protects the child. She knows how to work with words and symbols, with attention and care. Her presence has remained vivid for so long because she feels both divine and familiar. She stands near grief, but not helplessly. This may be one reason ancient Egyptian myths have continued to interest people for so many centuries. They are not only about gods being distant powers, they are about relationship. Between parent and child, king and people, order and disorder, river and land, body and spirit, name and memory. Even the dead are not treated as vanished. They remain part of the conversation. If you think of the tombs themselves, they are full of this conversation. A painted scene of people bringing food is not just decoration. It is participation. A written offering formula is not just text. It is a bridge. A statue is not just stone. It is a place where presence might be invited to settle. To modern eyes, the rituals can seem formal. To the ancient mind, they may have felt like practical kindness. Egyptian burial customs were especially careful because they treated the body as important. The body was preserved with extraordinary attention in mummification, though practices varied by period and status. Linen, natron, oils, amulets, and resins were used in a laborious process intended to guard the body for the journey beyond death. This was not simply about fear of decay. It reflected a belief that form mattered, that identity was tied to the body in deep and sacred ways. A wrapped body in a dim tomb can seem silent to us now, but for the Egyptians it was part of an ongoing relationship. Names were spoken, offerings were made, tombs were visited. The dead could be remembered with food, prayers, and care. They did not vanish completely into abstract distance. They remain near the living through memory and ritual. There is something tender in the way the ancient Egyptians wrote names on walls and objects. A name in that world was more than a label. It was a way of keeping someone present. To erase a name was a serious thing. To inscribe one was to help it endure. This may be why royal cartouches, those oval frames around names, feel so distinct. They are like little protected vessels for identity. And because identity mattered, storytelling mattered too. Myths often preserve old memories in altered form. A local deity becomes more universal. A ritual practice becomes a story. A political change leaves a mark in the way a god is described. Sometimes the myths are not single inventions, but accumulations, layered like paint on a wall that has been repainted and repaired over generations. The result is not confusion. It is depth. One can spend a long time simply noticing that depth. The lion-headed goddess Sekhmet, for example, may seem at first like a figure of blazing force. And she is. Yet she also belongs to a world of healing and protection, of medicine and authority. The same is often true of Egyptian divinity more broadly. Forms are not rigid. Power moves between danger and care. A god can be terrible and still be invoked for safety. Bastet, by contrast, often appears in more domestic and gentle associations, though her history is also layered and changeable. The cat itself, in ancient Egypt, became a familiar and beloved presence. Cats moved through houses, watched granaries, and held a place between usefulness and affection. In art, their graceful posture remains memorable. They seem to know how to be still. They seem to understand the value of a quiet room. That domestic world matters. It reminds us that Egyptian mythology was not only carved on temple walls or hidden in royal tombs. It also lived in homes. People used protective symbols. They kept small shrines. They relied on charms and blessings. The boundary between the sacred and the ordinary was not especially sharp. A kitchen could hold reverence. A bedroom could hold protection. A doorway could be watched over. The Nile itself, of course, was the great quiet center. It was the reason so much life gathered where it did. It carried silt, making the land fertile in a long and patient way. It offered routes of travel. It shaped settlement and agriculture. It was also full of symbolic weight because it seemed to mirror the cycle of giving and receiving. The river came, the river receded, and with that rhythm came planting, harvesting, and waiting. Ancient Egyptian myths often feel river-shaped. They move by return. They revisit themes. They let a figure disappear and then come back in another form. They let the underworld be a place of passage rather than final silence. They let the sky be alive. They let the land itself participate in the sacred order. In some sense, the landscape and the mythology are speaking the same language. When people today think of ancient Egypt, they often imagine pyramids first. And of course, the pyramids are astonishing. They are massive, exacting, and old beyond ordinary intuition. But they are also only one part of the larger world. They were built within a living culture of belief, administration, labor, and ritual. Their sides catch sun in a particular way. Their shape rises from the desert like a geometric thought. Yet around them were fields, workshops, roads, villages, and the daily movement of people who likely had little time to think of themselves as living inside a monument. That contrast can be useful. It keeps the ancient world human. Great stones were raised by people who likely also loved song, watched birds, worried about weather, and noticed who had not yet come home. The history behind the myths is not abstract. It is full of hands. The same can be said of the scribes. Writing in ancient Egypt was highly valued, and scribes occupied a special place in society. To read and write was to participate in administration, religion, and memory. Ink on papyrus, ink on wood, ink on pottery, ink on stone, all of it made time more durable. Without those marks, many stories would have vanished much sooner. Papyrus itself feels like a fitting material for this world. It comes from the riverland, from reeds and marshes, from something light that can still carry thought. A sheet of papyrus is delicate in the hand, but it can preserve prayers, inventories, letters, and mythic language. The ancient world did not need permanence to the same degree we often imagine. It needed enough persistence to let the next generation continue. There is a kind of gentle intelligence in that approach. Build what can last. Copy what matters. Speak the names again. Repair the wall. Rewrap the figure. Renew the offering. Repeat the ceremony. The repetition itself becomes meaningful. In some ways, ancient Egyptian culture seems to understand that continuity is made from small repeated acts rather than from one dramatic gesture. That may be why the surviving ruins feel so peaceful in certain light. A colonnade at dusk, a wall of hieroglyphs catching soft shadow, a statue with a worn nose, a broken obelisk lying where it fell. Nothing moves quickly there. The sun shifts. The sand gathers. Birds cross overhead. And the carved figures wait in their stone stillness, as if they have all the time in the world. Hieroglyphs, too, invite patience. They are often admired for their beauty, but they are also a system of signs that blends sound, meaning, and image. A bird may represent a sound, a reed may represent an idea, a hand may be both hand and symbol. To read them is to let picture and language overlap. It is a very Egyptian kind of thought, in that it does not separate the visual from the verbal as sharply as we often do. When you look closely, Hieroglyphic writing can feel almost like a silent music score. The arrangement matters. The direction matters. The balance on the stone matters. Even the empty space around signs has a kind of order. This is not only communication, it is composition. Some of the oldest mythic ideas in Egypt concern creation itself. Different cities told different creation stories, which is a good reminder that ancient religion was often local before it was universal. At Heliopolis, the sun and a primordial mound play central roles. At Hermopolis, a set of divine forces associated with chaos and potential appear in the beginning. At Memphis, thought, speech, and divine crafting shape the world. These stories do not cancel one another. They sit side by side, each preserving a different way of imagining beginnings. That plurality is quietly beautiful. It suggests that the ancient Egyptians were comfortable with layered truths, or at least layered explanations. The world could begin in several ways, depending on which city, which priestly tradition, which ritual context, which need. Creation was not one locked door. It was a family of doors. And because this was so, the myths could stay alive. They could be retold without always being reduced to a single version. A god might be older than one story and younger than another. A ritual might preserve an older cosmic memory while being used in a current political setting. Ancient systems often surprise us by being flexible. A calm evening is a good time to sit with that flexibility. The mind does not need to hurry. It can rest on one detail, then another. Painted lotus, a carved wing, a small stool in a tomb scene, a temple threshold worn smooth by many feet. Each thing is a fragment, but together they form a wide and patient landscape. The lotus itself is a flower often associated with rebirth and emergence. It opens in the light and closes with darkness. It rises from water. In Egyptian art, it can appear in hands, in garlands, in decorative patterns, in symbolic scenes of renewal. There is something almost naturally bedtime friendly about it. Suggests rest followed by opening, which is all one can ask of a night. Even the animals of Egypt enter the myths with a quiet dignity. Ibises, falcons, jackals, crocodiles, cats, cows, serpents, each one held symbolic weight depending on context. An animal in art was not always merely an animal. It could point to a divine quality, a protective force, or a cosmological role. But the creatures themselves were real too, moving through reeds, over sand, near water, and under evening skies. The jackal, linked with Anubis, brings us toward the more solemn edges of the Egyptian imagination. Anubis is often connected with embalming and the dead, a guardian figure who stands near transition. In a restful telling, there is no need to imagine him as frightening. He is more like a keeper of thresholds, an attendant to careful passage. He belongs to the dark, but not in a cruel way. He belongs to the work of escorting. Thresholds are important in Egyptian mythology. So are gates, doors, caverns, hidden chambers, and named pathways. The afterlife was sometimes imagined as a journey through regions that required knowledge. To know the right words mattered. To know the names mattered. This again gives the mythic world a practical shape. Wisdom is not just contemplation. It is orientation. There are many old texts in which the deceased must answer questions or pass through guarded spaces. These are not only tests. They are acknowledgments that movement through the unseen requires some kind of understanding. Even now, that idea has a gentle resonance. We all move through unknown areas of life by remembering what helps us remain calm, what words steady us, what names we trust. It is easy to forget while looking at grand temples or famous masks that so much ancient Egyptian religion depended on attention to small things. A bowl of water, a clean surface, a spoken offering, a reed pen, a carefully wrapped bundle. A correct title, a repeated prayer, a measured procession. The largest structures are built from minute acts of devotion and labor. That may be why fragments are so powerful. A broken statue can still hold authority. A chipped amulet can still suggest care. A torn papyrus can still preserve a sentence that traveled through time. The incomplete thing invites the imagination to rest beside it rather than to finish it quickly. There is room there. In that room, the Egyptian past feels less like a museum label and more like a soft set of rooms joined by doorways. One room holds creation stories. Another holds funerary practice. Another holds temple ritual. Another contains royal ideology. Another has household objects, toys, makeup, combs, mirrors, and everyday jars. These are not separate worlds. They overlap. People lived among them all. Cosmetics, for example, were important in ways that can surprise modern listeners. Eye paint was used by many people, not only for beauty, but also for practical and symbolic reasons. The dark lining around the eyes in art has become one of the visual signatures of ancient Egypt, but it was rooted in real materials and real habits. A face prepared for the day could also be a face prepared for protection. There is a similar blending of beauty and function in jewelry. Gold, faience, colored stone, amulets, beads, and collars all carried aesthetic and spiritual associations. A necklace could delight the eye and guard the wearer. A ring could mark status and offer protection. Objects in this world are often doubly alive, both useful and meaningful. Perhaps that is one of the reasons Egyptian art has endured so well in the imagination. It is precise, balanced, and clear, but it also leaves space for symbol. Profile faces, the arranged bodies, the measured gestures, the careful symmetry all suggest a civilization that loved order. Yet within that order it found room for prayer, myth, and memory. And memory, in a way, is the most comforting theme of all. The Egyptians remembered their dead. They remembered their kings. They remembered the names of gods. They remembered ritual formulas. They remembered to renew. They remembered to feed the ka, the vital essence often discussed in relation to offering and presence. The world stayed coherent because it was remembered back into place. This may sound solemn, but it can also feel gentle. To remember is to keep company. To repeat a name is to let it live a little longer. To return to a temple wall, even in imagination, is to acknowledge continuity across silence. The oldest stories do not have to shout to be heard. Sometimes they arrive like footsteps in sand, slow and steady. As the evening deepens, it is easy to think of a tomb corridor lit by lamps. The walls carry scenes of boats, fields, musicians, gods, and offerings. A reader might move along slowly, pausing here and there. The painted figures do not hurry. They are engaged in timeless tasks, carrying, leading, presenting, watching, blessing. Music, too, belonged to this world. Harps, flutes, percussion, and voice would have accompanied rituals and celebrations. The sound of a harp in an ancient setting has a natural softness. It seems to belong to rooms with incense and moving shadows. Song could be devotional, celebratory, or simply part of human gathering. Not all ritual was severe. Some of it may have been deeply beautiful. At festivals, the gods were sometimes carried or honored in processions. This allowed divine presence to move through a landscape, or at least through the social imagination of a city. The temple was not entirely closed off. There were moments when people could glimpse sacred objects, participate in public celebration, or feel themselves part of a wider order. A festival evening in ancient Egypt might have been lively, but even then it would have retained a certain structure, a measured rhythm. The calendar itself reflected the Nile and the stars. Time was marked by seasons tied to the river and agricultural cycles. The sky offered its own order. Certain stars, like Sirius, held special importance in relation to the inundation. The rising of the star and the rising of the river became linked in thought, another example of how the Egyptians allowed natural and mythic patterns to reflect one another. A civilization so attentive to cycles naturally produced stories with cycles in them. The sun returns. The river returns. The child god grows. The king renews. The dead are honored. The gods travel. The world is not linear in the modern sense. It is recursive, seasonal, and ceremonial. In a way, it feels appropriate for a bedtime listening experience. The mind can circle gently instead of marching ahead. Even the great stones of the temples seem to prefer circles of meaning to straight lines of argument. A column may resemble a papyrus stem. A capital may bloom like a flower. A wall may be covered with figures moving in ordered rows, each one caught in an eternal gesture. Such architecture does not merely contain ritual, it participates in it. One can imagine entering a temple courtyard at dusk. The air is warm. The stone holds the day's heat. A priest passes by quietly. Birds settle. The shadows grow longer between columns. There is a feeling of measured time, of inhabited space, of attention. Nothing needs to be dramatic. The place itself does enough. It is often said that the ancient Egyptians were obsessed with death, but that can be misleading. They were attentive to death, certainly, because they took continuity seriously. Yet much of their visual and textual world is filled with living things: bread, beer, fruit, boats, gardens, children, animals, music, work, movement, and sunlight. The afterlife was not imagined as an empty negation. It was a continuation of ordered existence, a place where the best parts of life might remain available. This is one reason the tomb paintings can feel so serene. Fish swim, birds fly, people harvest, boats glide. The images preserve life in forms that will not spoil. They are, in their way, acts of care against forgetting. There is also a deeply human caution in the old Egyptian approach to power. Kings were exalted, yes, but they were also folded into a larger system of cosmic balance. The ruler's role was to uphold Ma'at, a concept often translated as order, truth, justice, harmony, or rightness. Ma'at is another one of those Egyptian ideas that is best felt slowly. It is not a simple rule. It is a way the world should remain aligned. In a quiet sense, Ma'at is the dream of a life where things fit together. Crops grow, names are honored, falseness does not spread, the dead are remembered. Offerings are made, the river does its work, the stars keep their places, people speak carefully. The heart is measured with honesty. This is a larger vision than law alone. It is a moral atmosphere. Some Egyptian stories become especially moving when seen through that lens. The weighing of the heart, for instance, with its scales and its feather, is a vivid image of moral balance. Yet it is not necessarily meant to terrify in the way later readers sometimes imagine. It is also an image of fairness, of proportion, of being seen clearly. A heart that has lived well can be light enough to pass into peace. That image has lasted because it is simple and elegant. A heart, a feather, a scale, the body and the moral life together. It is easy to picture and easy to remember. Perhaps that is one reason Egyptian symbols endure so strongly. They condense many ideas into a small shape. As we continue to sit with these old beliefs, it may help to remember how much was never written down in full. Temple traditions could be guarded. Local myths may have been spoken and retold without surviving in complete form. Everyday devotion often leaves only traces. Archaeology gives us fragments, inscriptions, pottery, broken vessels, painted plaster, and partial texts. The silence around them matters too. Silence is not an absence of meaning here. It is part of the ancient setting. Dust settles, ink fades, wood decays, water changes course, yet enough remains to suggest a broad and intricate civilization that thought deeply about beginnings, endings, and the steady middle where most of life unfolds. And in the steady middle, people lived with patience. Farmers watched the river. Craftspeople shaped stone and gold. Mothers and fathers cared for children. Priests maintained rituals. Officials recorded grain. Scribes sharpened reeds. Travelers moved between towns. The great myths were present, but so were chores that carried the civilization forward one small day at a time. Even today, when we stand before an Egyptian artifact in a museum, we are looking at something that once passed through hands. A cup, a comb, a statue, a coffin fragment, a scarab, a painted shard. These things were touched, used, offered, stored, worn, and buried. They were part of ordinary human rhythm before becoming objects of wonder. There is a tenderness in that transformation. A scarab beetle, in particular, became an important symbol of renewal and becoming. Its simple shape, carrying the sun in symbolic form, linked the insect to creation and daily rebirth. What was once a small creature in the sand became a cosmic image. This is the kind of transformation Egyptian symbolism loves. The ordinary does not lose itself. It expands. The same can be said of boats, which appear often in Egyptian art and myth. Boats carried people on the Nile, of course, but they also carried gods and souls through imagined realms. A boat is a very old human answer to distance. It offers passage. It turns water from a barrier into a route. In myth, that practical function becomes spiritual journey. When the sun god travels by boat, the image gathers layers of meaning. Day becomes voyage. Night becomes passage through hidden waters. The horizon becomes a threshold. And the boat, small as it is compared with sky and earth, holds the promise that movement can continue. In some ways, Egyptian mythology is a great archive of thresholds. Dawn and dusk, life and death, land and river, temple and world, human and divine, speakable name and hidden name, visible body and enduring essence. The myths do not erase these boundaries. They make them legible and perhaps a little less lonely. That legibility is part of their quiet comfort. A child in an ancient household may have heard a story of a god protecting the weak. A worker might have worn an amulet before a long task. A mourner might have recited words that linked grief with hope. The stories were not merely distant lore. They were ways of being present. And now, after so many centuries, they still offer presence in a different way. We can sit with the image of Isis searching in stillness. We can imagine Osiris receiving the care of ritual. We can notice the sun's journey across the sky. We can picture a temple column standing in the evening light. We can let the names settle softly in the mind. Perhaps it is fitting that so much of what survives from ancient Egypt is fragmentary, because fragmentary things invite slow attention. A missing corner makes us look longer. A faded line asks us to imagine gently. A chipped face encourages the eye to rest on what remains. In that sense, the ruins themselves teach a kind of bedtime wisdom. Not everything needs completion to be meaningful. The desert around those ruins is vast and quiet. Sand drifts. Heat gives way to coolness. Stars appear with remarkable clarity. The horizon softens. In such a place, the old stories do not seem dead. They seem simply set down for the night, waiting in stone, waiting in names, waiting in the color of old paint. And if we listen long enough, we can almost feel the rhythm that underlies them all. River, sun, offering, return. River, sun, offering, return. The same pattern, not as monotony, but as reassurance. The world turns. The day ends. The night carries its own lamps. The gods travel. The dead are remembered. The living continue. There are still so many small details to notice in this ancient world. The way furniture was made with elegance and restraint. The way a simple stool could curve gracefully. The way a linen garment falls in the surviving images. The way a wall painting balances color and line. The way a scribe's hand could turn a practical note into something beautiful. These details are not separate from mythology. They are the setting in which mythology breathed. A culture is often best understood not only by its great monuments, but by what it repeats. Ancient Egypt repeated forms in architecture, in ritual, in writing, and in symbolic art. Repetition made memory durable. It also made the world feel ordered. In a long-lived civilization, repetition can become its own kind of wisdom. That wisdom is perhaps closest to the feeling of settling into bed while hearing a familiar, softly unfolding tale. You already know the rhythm. You do not need the plot to hurry. You can let the words arrive in waves. A god walking at dusk, a temple doorway, a name spoken into silence, a river moving under stars. As the listening grows quieter, it may be enough to remember that the ancient Egyptians were not only builders of tombs and temples. They were listeners to the river, readers of the sky, keepers of names, makers of symbols, and careful arrangers of life against forgetting. Their myths survive because they were woven into daily existence, and because they understood something simple and lasting, that what is cared for, named, and repeated can remain near us even after very long time. So the painted eye on the wall keeps watch. The boat continues across the dark water. The lotus closes softly at evening. The stars appear one by one. And in the deep quiet of the ancient land, the old gods rest in their stories, patient as stone, gentle as dust, and as enduring as the Nile moving through the night. There is still room for a few more quiet thoughts, and so we can stay a little longer beside the old river. We can think about how the Nile did not merely nourish Egypt, but gave the land a shape of mind. People learned to read its moods. They watched for its arrival, its spread, its retreat. They organized planting and harvest around it. A river that reliable becomes more than a waterway. It becomes a calendar, a map, and a way of thinking about time. That is one reason Egyptian myth never feels entirely separate from nature. The gods were not remote ornaments placed on top of a neutral world. They belong to the rhythms already present in wind, water, light, soil, and season. A god could be a principle of order, but also a presence in the daily life of the land. The mythic and the practical met one another often. A quiet illustration of that meeting is the way many deities were associated with specific places. Temples were not just generic sacred buildings. They belonged to the geography and memory of a town, a region, a cult center. People in one place might speak of a god in a slightly different way than people elsewhere. This created a civilization that was unified, yet never flattened. It kept its local colors, and local color matters. A river town at dawn would not feel the same as a desert edge at sunset. A temple of sandstone would hold light differently from a mud brick settlement. A marsh, a quarry, a palace, a burial chamber, each had its own mood. The myths adapted to those spaces, and the spaces in turn gave the myths texture. One can imagine a temple workshop where artisans paint, carve, and polish in a steady hush. They may not be thinking of themselves as artists in the modern sense. They are making objects that serve a ritual function, yet their hands leave behind line, style, proportion, and grace. The work is useful and beautiful at the same time, which is often the case in the most enduring cultures. There's also a quiet dignity in the materials themselves. Limestone, sandstone, granite, gold, faience, wood, reeds, linen, clay. Each material had its place. Each reacted differently to time. Stone remained while wood rotted. Paint faded while carving endured. Metal was reused. Cloth returned to the earth. The surviving record is therefore selective, and that selectiveness shapes what we think of as ancient Egypt. This means the past we know is both abundant and incomplete. We have enough to feel wonder and enough missing to feel humility. That combination is useful at night. It reminds us that knowledge can be gentle, partial, and still deeply satisfying. Some of the most graceful Egyptian images are of everyday abundance rather than divine spectacle. Baskets of fruit, loaves of bread, jugs of beer, lotus flowers, geese, small fish, stored grain, a table laid for offerings. These are quiet images, but they say something essential. Good life in that world included continuity of nourishment, honor for the dead, and the maintenance of order. Even the gods could be approached through such simple acts: a loaf placed carefully, a cup filled, a prayer spoken, a flame lit. The ritual imagination did not always require grandeur. It required correctness, attention, and repetition. And perhaps that is why ancient Egyptian religion still feels approachable. Its symbols are specific but not alien: a feather, a scale, a boat, an eye. A cat, a falcon, a lotus, a sun disk, a sarcophagus, a name in a frame. These are concrete things, but they are also portals into broader ideas. They are easy to picture when half asleep, which may be part of their lasting power. The more one spends time with these images, the more one notices how calm they can be. Even the most powerful scenes often have a balanced composition. Figures stand, kneel, or walk in orderly ways. The space around them is measured. Color is used with restraint. This visual discipline creates a kind of visual breathing room. That breathing room suits the gods themselves: Ra in his solar travel, Thoth in his association with writing and measurement, Hathor with music, joy, and welcome, Anubis with care for the dead, Isis with protection and restoration, Osiris with continuity beyond death, Mot with balance. These names can be spoken slowly, almost as a list of lanterns in the dark. And if some names are more familiar than others, that is all right. A bedtime story does not have to become a test. It only needs to leave the listener with a sense of shape. A civilization arranged around river, sun, tomb, temple, and name. A mythology that held daily life together. A record that survived in fragments and stones. Sometimes what remains is not the whole song, but the refrain. Ancient Egypt has many refrains. The sun returns. The dead are remembered. The river gives. The gods watch. The king upholds. The heart is weighed. The name endures. The images repeat until they become part of the atmosphere. If you were walking, very slowly, through a museum gallery of Egyptian artifacts late in the day, you might notice how the lighting changes across glass and stone. A small amulet may glow softly. A coffin panel may look almost alive in the dimness. A seated statue may seem to wait. The room itself becomes a kind of threshold, and the objects become companions in stillness. It is easy to forget that many of these objects once belonged to people who are now long gone, people who may have had no idea their belongings would one day travel far from home. Their lives were ordinary in many respects, though the civilization around them was extraordinary in scale. They lived, worked, loved, prayed, and died inside a world that found meaning in continuity. This continuity sometimes appears in the afterlife beliefs as a concern for preserving the self in multiple layers. There is the body, the name, the spirit aspects described in different ways, the memory of descendants, the offerings at the tomb. None of these are exactly the same, yet together they suggest that a person was held together by more than one thread. If one thread frayed, others might still remain. That idea can be strangely comforting. Human life is delicate. Memory is delicate. Bodies change. Names can fade. Yet there may be several forms of endurance, some material, some social, some symbolic, some sacred. Ancient Egypt devoted immense care to that insight. And so in the dark hours of the night, it is pleasant to let those careful forms drift by. A carved scarab, a painted shrine, a column of hieroglyphs, a riverboat, a papyrus reed, a wrapped figure, a sun disk, a house of mud brick in the heat, a cat in a doorway, a priest's measured step. A child listening to an old story. Each one feels like a small bead on a long string. The string itself is time. And time in the Egyptian imagination was not simply an enemy. It was a field to be worked with, marked, renewed, and ritually entered. The gods did not abolish time. They organized it, traveled through it, and gave it forms that people could recognize. That may be the quietest miracle of all. So we remain for a little longer in that ancient evening. The temple stones are cooling. The desert wind moves softly. The river reflects the first stars. Somewhere a scribe finishes a line and sets down the reed. Somewhere a lamp is dimmed. Somewhere a name is spoken once more, just to keep it near. And now, very gradually, we can let the old land settle into the dark. The myths do not disappear. They become part of the night air, part of the patient silence, part of the feeling of being safely held between one day and the next. The gods of ancient Egypt, with all their layered meanings and quiet symbols, rest in the mind like carved figures in a sealed chamber, waiting, calm, enduring, and still. The river goes on. The stars stay fixed for a while. The painted walls keep their color in memory. And the long, hidden story of ancient Egypt, with its gods, its offerings, its careful names, and its soft repetitions, remains near us as we drift toward sleep. And in that drifting, there is still so much more to notice, though nothing here needs to be rushed. Ancient Egypt rewards slow attention. It is a civilization of patient details. A single offering list may seem simple at first, yet it can open into a whole world of baked bread, cool water, oxen, linen, incense, beer, dates, and the quiet hope that life continues in some recognizable form. The list is practical, but it is also devotional. It says that what feeds the living may also comfort the dead. It says that a meal can be a memory, and a memory can become a gift. This is one of the gentle surprises of Egyptian religion. So many of its grandest ideas are carried by ordinary things. A jar, a loaf, a comb, a mirror, a bracelet, a chair, a bed, a boat. These were not merely possessions. They were part of the texture of a life that hoped to remain legible beyond death. In tomb scenes, people are shown doing familiar tasks with calm precision, almost as if eternity itself were being assembled from repetition. Someone grinds grain, someone pours liquid, someone brings flowers. Someone offers a duck, a goose, a basket of fruit, a linen garment. The actions are small, but the intention behind them is very large. The gods, too, often feel closer when they are seen in this measured way. They are not always distant, thunderous beings. Sometimes they are guardians of thresholds, protectors of sleep, keepers of breath, listeners at the edge of the world. Bes, with his stout, almost playful form, watches over households and childbirth. Taweret, the hippopotamus goddess, stands like a benevolent presence at the boundary between danger and safety. Hathor receives music and celebration, but also guides souls through the western horizon. Thoth writes, measures, and remembers. Maat, so often represented with her feather, is less a dramatic force than a principle of balance that lets the world continue. Balance is a quiet word, but in Egypt it held immense weight. The Nile had to rise. The seasons had to return. The king had to maintain order. The dead had to be properly cared for. The proper names had to be known. The ceremonies had to be spoken. Everything depended on continuation, on the right pattern repeated in the right way. Even the language of eternity seems here to favor repetition over interruption. What is sacred is what comes back, what fits, what holds. It is perhaps not surprising, then, that the Egyptian landscape itself appears almost designed for memory. The narrow green ribbon of the river gives way to broad desert margins, and those margins become the places of tombs and temples. Life gathers near the water, permanence settles farther out, on the dry edge where the dead can rest. The contrast is deeply evocative. The river changes and moves while the stone waits. The river carries the year forward, while the desert preserves the outlines of what has passed. Between them lies civilization, stretched and quiet, attentive to both motion and stillness. If you imagine this landscape at twilight, it becomes easy to understand why so many Egyptian images feel hushed. The sky turns amber, then rose, then deep blue. Birds settle. Water softens into reflection. Workers return from the fields. Boats drift toward the bank. Temples catch the last warmth of the day. Even the gods of the sun, who are often imagined in brilliance, are not only beings of glare and force, they are also beings of passage. The sun rises, travels, sets, and descends into the underworld, where it continues its invisible journey. Nothing is ever only one thing. Brightness already contains its own departure. The hidden tomb stories of Egypt belong to this same rhythm of appearance and concealment. Some tombs were built in obvious places, while others were tucked into cliffs, beneath sands, or behind walls that seemed to promise secrecy. Yet even the hidden tomb was not meant to be forgotten forever. It was hidden in order to protect, to preserve, to allow the dead to keep their integrity. In this way, concealment was a kind of care. The tomb was closed but not abandoned. It was sealed but not meaningless. It waited for the correct time, or perhaps simply for the patience of history. Many tombs have yielded surprises: a painted chamber with bright colors still clinging to plaster, a wooden coffin nested inside another, a set of canopic jars, each with a protective lid in the form of a god's head, a bundle of linens carefully wrapped around a mummy, a tiny amulet placed near the heart, a model boat meant to carry the deceased through an unseen river, a fragment of a hymn written on a shard of pottery. Such discoveries can feel almost like whispered messages crossing a very long distance. They remind us that the people who prepared these spaces did not believe they were making emptiness. They were making provision. Provision is another beautiful and quietly practical idea in Egyptian culture. The afterlife was not imagined as a vague cloud of reward. It was a place or a state that required support. Offerings were needed, spells were helpful, names were important. Maps of the underworld could be painted on coffin lids or written on papyrus. Guardians had to be known, doors had to be passed, the soul had to navigate. In that sense, religious texts were not abstractions. They were companions, tools for travel, written lights for a journey through darkness. Some of the most famous texts, like the so-called Book of the Dead, are not a single fixed book, but a collection of spells and formulas gathered over time. Their beauty lies partly in their adaptability. Different people used different selections. The texts were tailored, perhaps even personal in their own way. They might be written on papyrus, painted on tomb walls, or inscribed on funerary objects. To read them slowly is to sense a conversation between fear and hope. One spell asks for safe passage. Another asserts knowledge of a guardian's name. Another declares innocence. Another requests that the heart not testify against its owner. The whole tradition feels less like doctrine and more like a practiced art of surviving the unseen. The heart is especially important. In many modern imaginations, the mind is the seat of thought and identity, but in ancient Egyptian belief, the heart carried memory, judgment, intention, and moral weight. It was central in the assessment of the dead. In the famous weighing scene, the heart is measured against the feather of Maat. The image is memorable not because it is loud, but because it is so serene. There is no chaos in it. There is just a scale, a feather, a heart, and the surrounding certainty that balance matters. The scene suggests that a life can be weighed. It also suggests that the universe is attentive enough to do the weighing. There is something deeply human about wanting our lives to be legible at the end. Not perfect, perhaps, but readable. Ancient Egypt turned that wish into ritual form. The body was preserved. The tomb was supplied. The names were inscribed. The lineage was recorded. The gods were petitioned. The moral order was affirmed. Even the uncertainties of death were given language. This did not remove the mystery, but it made the mystery inhabitable. And Egypt, for all its splendor, remains full of inhabited mysteries. Consider the many small objects found in tombs whose exact purposes are still uncertain. Some are obvious enough, while others continue to invite discussion. What was the precise function of this figurine, this miniature tool, this painted symbol, this oddly shaped piece of wood or stone? Scholars can make careful proposals, but the past keeps some of its own counsel. That is one of the reasons ancient Egypt remains so absorbing. It is not only a solved puzzle, it is a still open conversation. There are also periods of Egyptian history that feel almost like layered rooms inside one another. The Old Kingdom, with its great pyramids and monumental confidence, gives way to later eras with their own shifts in power, art, piety, and administration. The Middle Kingdom refines literary and royal traditions. The New Kingdom expands outward, encountering neighboring lands, bringing back materials, people, and new artistic influences. Then later periods continue, modify, revive, and reinterpret old forms. Egypt did not simply rise and vanish. It persisted, adapted, and remembered itself. This long continuity is part of what gives Egyptian mythology its special character. A god can be ancient and still become newly important. An old symbol can be reused in a later age with altered emphasis. Religious forms can survive by changing shape just enough to remain living. In that sense, Egyptian culture seems to have understood preservation not as freezing, but as careful renewal. A form remains valid because it is tended. A story remains true because it is retold with respect. A temple remains holy because the rites continue. The temples themselves were not quiet in the same way a tomb is quiet, but they possessed a kind of ordered quietness. They were spaces of transition between the everyday and the divine. Walls rose. Columns stood like groves of stone. Painted scenes showed offerings, victories, processions, and sacred unions. The air would have carried incense, music, footsteps, perhaps the low sound of recitation. Yet the rituals were often intended to maintain cosmic stability. What happened inside the temple was not only ceremonial. It was, in Egyptian understanding, necessary for the world to stay in rhythm. A temple could also be a record of political power, since kings left their names and deeds upon its walls. But even this political dimension is shaped by sacral language. The king appears not simply as ruler, but as maintainer of order, intermediary, builder, donor, and restorer. His image on the walls is often larger than other figures, but the scale also speaks a language of significance. The king stands where the human and divine meet. He is one more thread in the fabric of continuity. And yet the people who lived outside palaces and temples matter just as much to the feeling of the civilization. The household gods, the charms tucked into clothing, the small altars, the amulets worn against illness or misfortune, the prayers for childbirth, the offerings left at local shrines, these reveal a religion that lived in homes as well as in monuments. A great civilization becomes more intimate when you notice its smallest devotional habits. A mother pinning an amulet to a child's garment. A worker whispering a short blessing before a long day. A fisherman asking for safe water. A scribe hoping his hand remains steady. The divine is made near through repetition and trust. Ancient Egyptian magic, often misunderstood in modern retellings, belonged to this same practical and sacred world. It was not necessarily separated from religion the way we might separate categories now. Words had power. Names had power. Images had power. Sympathetic forms had power. A carved object could participate in the thing it represented. A spoken formula could open a path. A symbol could guard a threshold. Magic was, in part, an extension of the conviction that the universe listens closely to pattern and utterance. This makes Egyptian texts especially lovely to linger over. Even when they concern protection, their language can feel measured and full of dignity. There is often no rush in them. They invoke, identify, transform, and affirm. They do not always speak in dramatic tones. They seem to trust that proper speech itself can steady a moment. One can imagine a priest reciting slowly, or a family member repeating a prayer with quiet care, and the words settling into the space like dust settling after a breeze. Dust is another presence in Egypt that deserves gentle attention. In the desert, dust can preserve. In the fields, it can obscure. On a tomb floor, it can seal and protect. It is a material that seems almost to belong to time itself. Sand can hide a ruin for centuries, and then a shift of wind or a careful excavation reveals a wall or a stair or a forgotten doorway. So many Egyptian discoveries have that quality of emergence. Something long absent becomes visible again, not because it moved, but because the world around it changed. The opening of a tomb can feel like entering a pause. Air has been absent. Light has not touched the surfaces for a very long time. The first look inside is not merely archaeological, it is almost ceremonial. There may be paintings of figures bringing offerings. There may be inscriptions naming the deceased and listing titles, family relations, prayers, and hopes. There may be a sarcophagus, perhaps nested within others, perhaps decorated with eyes so the dead can look outward, perhaps painted in rich blues and golds, perhaps surprisingly plain. Every tomb teaches a slightly different lesson about how a person wished to be remembered. Some were clearly for kings, those vast monuments that continue to dominate the imagination. Others were for nobles, officials, craftsmen, priests, and family groups. The grandeur varies, but the intention feels related. A tomb is a declaration that a life deserves structure after death. It says this person mattered. This name should be preserved. This body should be protected. This memory should be fed. In a world where so much else is transient, the tomb becomes an anchor. The pyramids, too, are part of this broad desire for permanence, though they can seem almost too large for ordinary comprehension. Their geometry has a stillness to it. They rise from the ground in simple, severe forms, as if the idea of ascent had been reduced to its most enduring shape. They were once encased in smooth limestone, reflecting sunlight, appearing perhaps even brighter than we can now imagine. Today they are weathered, stripped, and familiar in a way they were never meant to be. Yet they retain a kind of silence that no later ruin can quite duplicate. They are at once obvious and mysterious. Everyone knows them, and no one fully enters their original world. Inside that world, the pyramid was not merely a tomb, but a statement about kingship, cosmic order, and the sun. It connected the deceased ruler to the sky, to the horizon, to transformation. The exact beliefs attached to each structure evolved over time, but the impulse was consistent. The king, in death as in life, was part of the maintenance of the world. His monument was therefore not only personal but theological. Later royal burials became more hidden, especially in places like the Valley of the Kings, where tombs were cut into rock and concealed among cliffs. This shift toward secrecy reflects both practical concern and sacred adaptation. The dead king was still honored, but now the architecture favored concealment over visibility. The tomb became a hidden chamber in a mountain, a place where passages turned and descended, where painted texts guided the royal soul, where the walls themselves became books of the night. The valley feels quiet even in daylight. One can almost sense how it would have seemed before excavation, when only the wind and the rock knew its contents. And there are still unanswered questions in those valleys. Some tombs were unfinished. Some were entered in antiquity. Some may have belonged to rulers whose burial circumstances remain debated. Some chambers were altered, reused, or expanded, leaving traces of intention and interruption in the same space. This is one of the peculiar beauties of archaeology, the evidence of plans that did not fully conclude. A cut in the rock that stops midway, a wall painted but never completed, a corridor sealed by ancient hands, a burial disturbed, repaired, or relocated. Each remains a fragment of human intention, and intention itself can be poignant when only partly visible. Egypt's history is filled with such fragments, and perhaps that is why it continues to attract the mind at night. Sleep likes fragments. It likes soft continuities and unresolved edges. It likes the way a long story can become a series of images that drift without pressure. A temple lamp, a river shimmer, a block of carved stone, a face on a wall, a red line drawn on papyrus, a blue bead on a cord, a falcon in profile, a jackal-headed guardian, a lotus flower opening in the morning, a king's cartouche, a votive statue, a painted star ceiling. These things do not insist. They remain. It is worth pausing over the Egyptian love of stars because the sky was never just empty above them. The stars mark the timing of rituals, the orientation of structures, and the imaginative shape of the afterlife. The northern circumpolar stars were especially significant in some periods because they appeared fixed, never sinking below the horizon. That quality made them powerful symbols of endurance. To look up and see what does not set is to receive a lesson in stability, however brief. The heavens move, but some points seem steadfast. The dead king, too, might be imagined among them. The night sky in ancient Egypt was not cold in feeling. It was inhabited. It had pathways. It had beings. It had a great serpent, a bark, a hidden journey, protective goddesses, and a solar voyage through darkness. In some texts, the sun travels through the underworld and is renewed at dawn. The journey is both perilous and assured. This, perhaps, is one of the oldest comforting stories humans have told themselves. That darkness is not an ending, but a passage that contains its own return. The concern for return extends beyond the sun. Floods returned. Festivals returned. Generations returned in names and offerings. Scribes copied old texts. Priests repeated old rituals. Artists continued established styles, sometimes for centuries, while allowing small changes in detail. Ancient Egypt had many moments of innovation, but it also had a deep commitment to recognizable form. There is comfort in that. A person in one dynasty could read a text or see a symbol inherited from a much earlier age and still understand it, perhaps differently, but recognizably. Continuity makes time feel less like a break and more like a river with a steady current. Still, the river itself could be unpredictable. Too little flood and the fields suffered. Too much and the banks might be damaged. Balance was never automatic. It had to be maintained by labor, ritual, administration, and faith. This is why the divine order was so deeply tied to practical life. If the universe was not balanced, the harvest might fail. If the harvest failed, the people would hunger. If the king did not perform his role, the system of meaning would be strained. The sacred and the everyday were woven tightly together. That weaving appears in the art as well. Egyptian figures are often shown in a style that is at once formal and deeply human. A person stands with one foot forward, hands holding a staff or an offering, eyes outlined, body turned according to convention. The pose repeats across centuries, but inside that repetition there can be startling individuality in face, hairstyle, jewelry, or inscription. It is as if the civilization found a way to say both. This is a person, and this is the right shape of a person. That tension between individuality and pattern is one of the reasons the art remains so moving. The same holds true for the names that survive. Some are familiar from kings and queens: Khufu, Hatshepsut, Akhenaten, Ramesses, Tutankhamun. Others are less well known, preserved in tomb labels, tomb biographies, legal texts, letters, and ostraca. Every name is a small bridge across time. Some were spoken daily by family members. Some were carved in stone and then forgotten for centuries. Some were recovered by modern scholarship, pronounced again in classrooms and museums, quietly re-entering the air. To say an ancient name is to give it a tiny renewal. There is a particular tenderness in Egyptian funerary inscriptions that ask the passerby to speak the deceased's name aloud. The request is simple, almost modest. It does not demand admiration. It asks for remembrance. A spoken name, in that worldview, is not trivial. It is a form of sustenance. And so the living help the dead remain near by being willing to remember them. The boundary between generations becomes permeable through speech. The dead, in turn, may protect the living by remaining properly included in the chain of memory. Such mutuality gives the tombs a moral dimension. They are not merely containers for bodies. They are sites of ongoing relationship. The dead are not wholly gone if the living continue to visit, offer, and recite. In that sense, a tomb is less like a final room than like a maintained household on the edge of visibility. It requires care. It answers care. It is a place where affection and duty meet. One can imagine the people who maintained these spaces over time. A descendant bringing bread and beer. A priest cleaning a shrine. A family member brushing dust from an inscription. A worker repairing a crack in a wall. A scribe updating a funerary text. A gardener tending the approach to a chapel. These acts are not dramatic, but they are durable. Civilization often survives through such quiet maintenance. A lot of history is the labor of keeping things in place. And then there is the mystery of what people felt as they did it. Not every belief is transparent to us now. Some practices may have blended fear, hope, habit, and genuine devotion in ways that resist simplification. We can study objects, texts, and images, but the interior weather of the ancient mind remains partly hidden. This is not a failure of history. It is part of its dignity. The past does not become less real because it is not entirely accessible. It becomes more human. Perhaps that is the deepest appeal of ancient Egypt at bedtime. It offers grandeur, yes, but also an atmosphere of measured uncertainty. We can see enough to be fascinated, but not so much that the mystery vanishes. We know of hidden chambers, but not always their original contents. We know of gods, but not always the full texture of their worship in every town and century. We know of kings, but not every feeling around them. We know of tombs, but not every voice that prayed there. So the imagination continues gently, filling the spaces with respectful silence. The silent spaces matter. In Egypt, silence was not empty. It could be a place where images breathe, where the dead rest, where the desert listens, where a temple at dusk waits for its next rite. Silence is what lets fragments shine. A bead glinting in a case, a painted eye on a coffin, a line of glyphs, a blue faience amulet, a little figure of a servant pushing a grindstone, a mourning woman carved in profile, a scribe at his work, a papyrus boat, a cobra lifting from a crown. All of them become more visible when the mind is still. And so, in this stillness, we can also think of the many lesser-known gods and spirits whose names survived only in specialized texts or regional traditions. Ancient Egypt was never a single fixed system. It was a wide landscape of local devotions, family rites, royal theology, and learned temple traditions. Some deities rose in prominence in one time or place and receded in another. Some merged with others. Some acquired new epithets. Some were ancient beyond easy tracing. This fluidity gives the religion a living quality. It was not a machine. It was an ecology. Even the familiar great names were often layered. Ra could appear as creator, sun god, hidden power, traveling bark, or merged form with other gods. Osiris could be king of the dead, fertile ruler, judge, and symbol of renewal. Isis could be wife, mother, magician, mourner, protector, queen. Horus could be falcon, kingly emblem, avenger child, horizon figure. These layered identities do not confuse the tradition so much as reveal its richness. The gods were not flattened into single functions. They were allowed to remain multivalent, like symbols that keep revealing another side when the light changes. This is perhaps why their images endure so well in memory. A falcon on a standard, a throne sign beneath a goddess's head, a scarab rolling the sun, a lioness crouched in warning, a baboon raising its hands, a crocodile partly submerged, a cat with alert ears. Egyptian mythology loves forms that are both visible and suggestive. It invites the mind to move slowly between image and meaning. Nothing is exhausted immediately. The symbol continues to unfold. In the same way, the hidden tomb stories continue to unfold. Each discovery may answer one question and open several more. Who is buried here? Why was the tomb re-entered in antiquity? Which objects were placed for daily use in the next life and which were primarily symbolic? What local customs shaped this burial? Why was this text chosen? Why this color? Why this orientation? The questions accumulate softly, like layers of linen around a body, and each layer is part of the meaning. There is also the slow work of modern restoration, which itself has something patient and almost devotional about it. Conservators gently stabilize pigments. Archaeologists document contexts. Epigraphers copy inscriptions. Curators control light and humidity. Historians compare texts. Scientists examine materials. Each discipline adds a modest strand to the whole, and none of it happens quickly. The ancient world, having waited so long to be seen, is not in a hurry now. It can be comforting to know that scholarship itself can be a quiet craft. Not all knowledge arrives in flashes. Much of it comes through repeat visits, careful measurements, and the willingness to look again. The past often reveals itself in increments. A tiny inscription becomes legible. A fragment of textile is identified. A resin is analyzed. A burial sequence is reconstructed. A damaged scene acquires context from a nearby wall. Slowly, the old silence becomes more intelligible, though never fully transparent. And perhaps full transparency would not suit it. Ancient Egypt would lose some of its spell if every chamber were opened and every motive proven beyond doubt. Part of what draws people to it is the combination of clarity and concealment. We can stand before a statue and feel the presence of a personified ideal. We can read a hymn and hear devotion. We can study a tomb plan and see architecture shaped by belief. Yet a certain depth remains beyond the diagram, like water below a boat that continues unseen. That hidden depth may be the most restful part of all. It means the imagination has room to breathe. It means the ancient world is not exhausted by facts, though the facts are beautiful. It means a bedtime journey through Egypt can stay soft and open with no need to conclude too sharply. The gods continue their watch. The dead remain remembered. The river moves. The desert keeps its secrets. The stars hold their slow positions. A tomb door stands sealed in the mind, not as an absence, but as a quiet promise of continuity. So let the evening keep widening. Let the temple courtyards grow dim. Let the painted ceilings darken into stars. Let the riverbank reeds rustle and then become still. Let the amulets rest in their boxes. Let the papyrus fibers soften in memory. Let the jackal, the falcon, the ibis, and the cat settle into the long stillness of myth. Let the names be spoken once more, then laid gently down. Let the hidden chambers remain hidden, and let that be enough. Ancient Egypt does not need to be solved tonight. It only needs to be held softly in the mind, like a small lamp in a closed hand. The flame is modest. The light is warm. The shadows around it are not threatening. They are simply the larger room of history where so many lives once moved with purpose and care. And as that room grows quiet, the old land becomes less like a distant study and more like a restful dream. The gods stand at their thresholds. The tombs keep their patient watch. The river remembers the path of the moon. The stones remember the touch of tools. The names remember the mouths that spoke them. The silence remembers everything else. So now, very gently, we can allow the story to rest. The ancient world does not vanish when we close our eyes. It settles beside us, calm and layered, full of quiet forms and hidden chambers, full of the soft persistence that made Egypt endure for so long. And in that persistence, there is a comfort as steady as stone, as fluid as water, as enduring as a name carried forward by care. Sleep may come as the river comes, unhurried and sure. Sleep may come as the temple lamps fade. Sleep may come as the desert cools. Sleep may come as the stars deepen overhead. And in that peaceful dark, the quiet gods of ancient Egypt remain where they have always been, not far away, but just beyond the threshold, keeping watch over memory, over mystery, and over the long, gentle turning of the night. Night can continue from there without any effort at all, as if the mind were a small boat allowed to drift past river reeds and silent stone. In that drifting, ancient Egypt becomes less a set of dates and names and more a landscape of patient surfaces. A carved lintel, a painted offering table, a doorway that once opened into incense and shadow, a row of Ushabti figures standing in quiet readiness, a string of beads laid beside a linen-wrapped hand. These are not loud things. They do not insist. They simply remain. And perhaps that is part of why Egypt feels so soothing to think about when the day is ending. So much of its art was made to endure, yet so much of it also had an intimate purpose. A wall scene was not only decoration. It was a continuation of life. A statue was not only likeness. It was a place for presence. A tomb was not only a chamber. It was a carefully prepared home for memory. Even the most imposing monuments were, in a way, acts of tenderness toward what would not last. They were built because the Egyptians knew that bodies weaken, voices fade, and names can be forgotten unless someone takes care. There is something very human in that. The pyramid, for all its grandeur, began with the small and necessary concern that a person should not simply disappear. The same concern appears in more modest burials too, in villages far from royal courts, where families placed bowls, jewelry, tools, or amulets with the dead. The scale changed, but the feeling remained familiar. To remember someone was to give them a kind of shelter. To supply a painted loaf, a clay vessel, a written name, a spoken prayer was to say, in a quiet way, you are still part of the world. Egypt's long history offers many such gestures. In the earliest dynastic tombs, there were already carefully arranged goods and signs of attention to the afterlife. Over time, those customs became more formalized, then more elaborate, then in some places more personal again. The forms changed with time, as all human customs do, but the underlying pulse remained steady. There was always the sense that life did not end neatly at the edge of the body. It continued in memory, in ritual, in name, in image, in offering. The dead were not simply gone. They were relocated into another kind of care. That belief made Egyptian religion feel both vast and intimate. The gods could be cosmic, older than mountains, linked to creation, order, the sun, the sky, the flood, and the invisible movement of time. Yet they were also present in small household practices, in amulets tucked beneath clothing, in protective figures near beds, in prayers said for a safe journey, a healthy child, a favorable harvest, a peaceful rebirth. A deity might appear as a falcon above the horizon or as a cat sitting in a domestic corner. Divinity could be large enough to encompass the heavens and still close enough to guard a doorway. It is easy to imagine the quiet rhythm of such a world at dawn. The first light on the river, the sound of paddles or oars, workers crossing mudflats while the air is still cool, smoke rising from small hearths, the smell of bread, the call of birds, temple doors opening to receive daily offerings. Priests moving with practiced precision, Not every day was ceremonial and not every moment was grand. Much of life then as now was repetition, fetching water, grinding grain, mending linen, checking the sky, watching the seasons, waiting for the flood to behave. These ordinary acts formed the background against which kings, queens, and gods were remembered. The Nile was the great steady presence beneath all of it. For ancient Egyptians, it was not merely geography. It was timing, nourishment, and direction. It made fields possible. It shaped settlement patterns. It marked the year. Its annual rise was anticipated with attention and gratitude because it brought the dark, fertile silt that kept life returning. In modern terms, we might speak of hydrology and agriculture, but the Egyptian experience of the river was also emotional and sacred. The flood was both practical and mysterious. It seemed to arrive with a promise. Then it receded. Then the work of planting began again. Such a cycle could easily become a model for death and rebirth. That is why so much Egyptian thought circles around renewal. The sun sets and returns. The moon waxes and wanes. The river rises and falls. A seed is placed into darkness and emerges green. The dead are laid in the earth and imagined into another mode of being. Even the setting sun carried a kind of narrative weight, journeying through the underworld each night before rising again at dawn. The Egyptians loved continuity, but not because they thought life was static. They loved it because they had watched the world transform repeatedly and had found in that transformation a pattern gentle enough to trust. One can imagine that trust shaping the quiet architecture of tombs. The chambers were built not only to protect possessions, but to organize a passage. A corridor could become a symbolic path. A burial chamber could become a stable interior world. Wall paintings could provide scenes of agriculture, banquets, fishing, hunting, and offerings, as if to surround the deceased with a familiar and sustaining life. This was not an escape from reality so much as an attempt to preserve its best forms. The dead, in Egyptian imagination, were not cut off from everything. They retained relationship, status, need, and identity. They still required food, attention, and remembrance. Such care extended to the writing of names. The Egyptians knew the power of naming perhaps as clearly as any ancient people. A name was not just a label. It carried identity, continuity, and presence. To carve a name on stone was to grant duration. To recite it aloud was to call someone back into thought. This is one reason tombs feel so poignant. They are often full of names that were once spoken by relatives, scribes, and priests, then buried, forgotten, rediscovered, and spoken again centuries later by archaeologists and visitors who did not know the original voices, but can still feel the human effort behind them. A name preserved in limestone or painted plaster can cross immense spans of time with startling gentleness. Some names are attached to famous rulers, and some to people who lived quietly outside the center of power. Egypt's kings and queens received the most attention, of course, because they left behind monuments large enough to continue speaking. Yet the wider history of Egypt is also preserved in more modest traces. A pottery jar stamped with an administrative mark, a letter from one worker to another, a child's toy, a pair of sandals, a list of grain deliveries, a charm worn smooth from contact. These things suggest a society that was not built only on spectacle, but on bookkeeping, labor, exchange, and the ordinary need to stay warm, fed, and protected. There is comfort in noticing that ancient civilizations were full of practical minds. The people who designed temples and tombs also measured fields, tracked months, repaired boats, tallied grain, and maintained workshops. In the background of grand religious thought was an everyday intelligence devoted to keeping life running. The same civilization that imagined the solar bark sailing through the sky also knew how to make a reed pen, mix ink, stretch linen, bind papyrus, bake bread, and organize a storehouse. Reverence and routine moved side by side. It is easy to picture a scribe in a shaded room, carefully copying lines onto papyrus. The fingers are stained with ink. The reed pen is cut just so. The surface of the papyrus has its own texture, almost like woven fabric. The writing may be a hymn, a record, a list, a legal note, or a funerary text intended to guide the dead. The work is quiet and exacting. A mistake can be corrected. A line can be traced again. The scribe is part of a long chain of transmission that depends upon patience more than speed. History often survives because someone took time to write a thing down neatly. And then there are the tomb texts themselves, those careful collections of spells and utterances that reveal so much about Egyptian thought. To modern ears, the word spell can sound theatrical, but many of these texts are best understood as forms of guidance, reassurance, and sacred speech. They name gates, guardians, dangers, transformations, and protections. They help the deceased know where to go and what to say. They do not feel frantic. They feel organized. They create a map for the invisible world. In this sense, ancient Egyptian funerary literature is not only mysterious but practical in its own way. It tries to reduce uncertainty. It tries to make the crossing less lonely. That same impulse appears in amulets, which are among the most intimate objects from ancient Egypt. Some were shaped like gods, eyes, scarabs, knots, or small hearts. Some were tucked among wrappings, others worn in life. They were made from stone, faience, metal, or glass, and each material had its own subtle sheen. The eye amulet, for instance, could signify protection and healing. The scarab suggested becoming, movement, and renewal. The jed pillar implied stability and endurance. The tayyat knot offered a sense of safeguarding. These objects were tiny, but they held large hopes. They were a reminder that safety can be carried in the palm of a hand. A bedtime mind might enjoy these things because they are so small, and yet they suggest such large worlds. A bead of blue faience might recall the color of the Nile or the sky. A polished green stone could evoke growth and rebirth. A gold leaf on a funerary mask catches what little light remains in a chamber. A black coal line around the eye both beautifies and protects. In Egypt, even ornament could be practical, and even protection could be beautiful. The boundary between the useful and the sacred was often soft. One can rest for a moment inside that softness. The artisans shaping a coffin, the painters grinding pigment, the jeweler stringing beads in a narrow workshop, the carver smoothing a statue's cheek. The potter turning clay into a vessel that will hold bread, beer, oil, or water. The worker at a quarry, the team hauling a block of stone, the boatmen on the river, the gardener tending sycamore and date palm. Each of these lives existed within the immense span of Egyptian history, and each contributed to the long continuity that makes the civilization feel so deep and so stable. Not because it never changed, but because it changed in recognizable rhythms. There's an almost musical quality to those rhythms. Dynasty after dynasty, belief after belief, the same land remained under the same sky, and people kept reinterpreting what they saw. New capitals were founded. Old customs were adapted. Foreign rulers arrived and were absorbed into Egyptian forms. Temples were expanded. Gods merged or split in emphasis. Styles of art shifted subtly, then more noticeably. Yet all the while, the underlying fascination with order, protection, and the afterlife persisted. It is one of the reasons Egyptian history invites long, dreamy contemplation. It is not a single story with a simple arc. It is a river of variations on endurance. At times that endurance appears in the architecture of the dead. The step pyramid at Saqqara, for example, feels almost like a stairway made of light and shadow, a monumental experiment in permanence. Earlier mastaba tombs and later pyramids share the same desire to preserve. but the form grew outward into something more skyward and symbolic. The shape itself can seem serene when imagined from a distance. The layers step up like a slow ascent. Nearby, the desert lies pale and still. The workers have gone home. Only the monument remains, its geometry catching the angle of the sun. It is easy to see why such structures have held the imagination for so long. They are simple enough to read at a glance, and complex enough to repay endless study. And yet, even the Great Pyramids are surrounded by quieter histories. There are the workers' villages, the bread molds, the copper tools, the administrative texts, the physical evidence of organized labor and support systems. There are the people who fed the builders, carried the water, maintained the boats, and prepared the site. There are the names of officials who oversaw supply lines and inventories. There is the constant reminder that monumental history is never only monumental. It is built from countless careful acts. That is perhaps another soft comfort in Egypt's story. Great things were not made by force alone. They were assembled from discipline, patience, and shared effort. The same is true of burial customs over time. Some tombs were richly furnished, others more modest. Some were hidden in secluded valleys, while others sat closer to habitation. Some belonged to royalty, with elaborate chambers and symbolic programs. Others belonged to officials, artisans, or families whose identities survive only through a few inscriptions and objects. The Valley of the Kings has its own aura of concealment, with tombs cut into limestone cliffs and painted with vivid scenes of the afterworld. But there are quieter necropolises too, where the dead were laid to rest beneath simple markers or in reused chambers. The world of Egyptian death was broad enough to contain many social levels, many hopes, many forms of remembrance. And beneath that broadness is a certain tenderness in the Egyptian relationship with the body. Care taken in mummification was not abstract. It was intimate and meticulous. The body was washed, wrapped, anointed, and protected through a process that linked medicine, ritual, and belief. To modern readers, the details can seem strange or even severe, yet they arose from a deep conviction that the body mattered to identity and survival. Preservation was not only about fear of decay, it was about dignity. It was about ensuring that the self had a recognizable form through which it could continue. The wrappings, the resin, the linen, the amulets, the mask all worked together in a language of continuity. In quiet evenings of thought, one can see the layers of linen almost as layers of care. The hands of embalmers move with knowledge passed on through generations. The room is cool. The air holds the faint scent of natron, resin, and cloth. A family waits, grieving and trusting. A name is spoken. Offerings are prepared. The deceased is not reduced to a body alone, but neither is the body ignored. It is treated as something that deserves attention because it has carried a life, a voice, a memory. Ancient Egypt is often associated with the mysterious, but at heart it is also a civilization of meticulous care. That care shows up in domestic religion as well. Households kept protective symbols. People relied on household deities, ancestor memory, and practical rites that fit naturally into the flow of daily life. A small shrine might stand near a wall niche. A figurine might be placed in a threshold area. A prayer might be said quietly before a journey or after a child's illness. Such gestures were not always grandly recorded, but they formed the lived texture of belief. Religion was not only a temple affair. It was woven into the rhythms of waking, eating, working, and sleeping. Some of Egypt's most beloved gods are impressive precisely because they occupy this broad range of scales. Osiris, for instance, embodies death, rebirth, kingship, and the hope of renewal. He is often imagined as a ruler who has passed through death and become a figure of enduring authority in the underworld. Isis, with her great protective and restorative power, stands as a goddess of healing, motherhood, magic, and loyalty. Horus, associated with kingship and the sky, appears in forms both fierce and protective. Thoth, linked to writing, calculation, and wisdom, feels almost like the quiet mind of civilization itself. Bastet brings gentleness, household comfort, and feline grace. Hathor offers music, joy, and nourishment. Anubis watches over the dead with solemn attentiveness. None of these gods exist in isolation. They belong to a network of meanings that could be felt as much as explained. It is easy to imagine why cats became so beloved in this world. They moved softly, guarded grain, and seemed to possess a calm dignity that made them natural companions to domestic spaces and divine symbolism alike. A cat sitting in a patch of sunlight is not unlike a small temple statue in its composure. And the same civilization that honored cats also admired jackals, ibises, crocodiles, falcons, and cows, not because animals were worshipped as animals alone, but because they revealed attributes of the divine. The animal world was read as a field of signs, each creature carrying a quality that could be made sacred. Speed, watchfulness, fertility, power, grace, and protection all found forms in living beings. There is something comforting in this way of seeing. It suggests that the world is full of meanings that can be approached gently through observation. The movement of birds, the habits of animals, the flooding of the river, the appearance of the moon, the heat of the desert, the coolness of stone, the scent of papyrus, the rustle of palm leaves. Ancient Egyptians did not separate the sacred from the observable. They watched, interpreted, and responded. Their world was full of correspondences. A symbol was not a decoration added later. It was a way of staying attentive. That attentiveness appears also in their calendars and timekeeping. They observed celestial patterns and seasonal cycles with remarkable patience. The stars mattered. The heliacal rising of Sirius, associated with the coming of the flood, linked sky and river in a particularly elegant rhythm. Night itself was not a blank absence, but a realm of movement and navigation. The gods traveled through darkness. The dead journeyed. The stars held their positions. The sky became a kind of sacred map. When one lies awake at night, there is perhaps a small kinship with that ancient attention. The room is dark but not empty. Shapes remain. Time continues, quietly and without hurry. The Egyptian use of astronomical and calendrical knowledge reminds us again that their spiritual life was never detached from practical observation. It was grounded in the environment. The seasons of labor depended on the river. The timing of festivals aligned with cosmic and agricultural events. Temples were oriented with purpose. Monuments engaged the sun. The built world participated in the order of the heavens. Even the greatest structures often appear less as isolated achievements and more as precise answers to a living landscape. And yet there is still mystery. A temple can be measured, and still the feeling it was meant to produce may resist full capture. A tomb can be photographed, mapped, and cataloged, and still its atmosphere remains partly beyond explanation. The ancient Egyptians themselves may have welcomed that. They left room for hiddenness. Some chambers were sealed, some texts were restricted, some rites were performed in inward spaces. The visible world was not the whole world. That, too, can be restful to consider. Not everything important has to be exposed. Some meaning can remain inward, protected, and dim. There are also the quiet mysteries of lesser-known tombs, those found in places where no dramatic treasure greeted the eye, only signs of human intention. A burial in a remote cliffside. A painted coffin buried under layers of later history. A cache of objects hidden in the ground. An overlooked cemetery where patterns of disease, age, and care can be read from bones and grave goods. Such discoveries remind us that archaeology is not always about spectacle. Often it is about recovering small lives from large silences. A child's burial with a toy, a woman's adornment carefully placed, a worker's simple amulet, a family's repeated use of a cemetery over generations. These are the fragile threads from which ancient society becomes visible again. One can imagine walking slowly through such a cemetery in thought, not with urgency, but with respectful curiosity. The ground is quiet. The wind is light. The stones are warm from the sun. A few inscriptions. A broken vessel lies near a grave shaft. Somewhere nearby, the old city once lived its noise, and now only a murmur survives in the imagination. The people buried here had names, hopes, illnesses, meals, arguments, routines, and private joys. They are not abstractions. They are individuals who once knew the feel of the same kind of morning air. To remember them softly is one way of honoring the civilization they belonged to. Ancient Egypt spans so many centuries that it can feel like several civilizations sharing a long riverbank. The Old Kingdom has a different mood from the New Kingdom, which differs again from later periods when foreign influence, local adaptation, and renewed traditions intertwined. But throughout all these changes, there is an underlying continuity of memory and place. The language evolved, the art shifted, the politics changed, yet the river still flowed. The desert still framed the land. The temples still oriented people toward the divine. The dead still received offerings. Names still mattered. That continuity lends Egypt a special serenity in hindsight, even though the lived history was full of conflict, uncertainty, and human complexity. And the gods, those quiet gods of Egypt, were never simple. They could merge, divide, travel between regions, absorb local features, and develop over time. A god might have many forms, many epithets, many aspects. This flexibility made Egyptian religion remarkably resilient. Divine could be simultaneously local and national, familial and cosmic, familiar and mysterious. A god at one shrine might emphasize healing, while elsewhere that same deity's role centered on fertility or protection. Rather than weakening belief, this multiplicity allowed it to breathe. It made the sacred adaptable to different landscapes and different needs. This flexibility can be felt in the famous practice of syncretism, where gods were associated with each other across traits and functions. Such associations were not careless mixtures. They were ways of perceiving shared powers. The sun could be understood through several deities at once. Kingship could gather divine qualities from different sources. The underworld had its own intricate population of guardians, judges, and transformed beings. Rather than flattening the religious imagination, these layered identities enriched it. The divine world became a place of relationships rather than isolated figures, much like human society itself. There is a gentle lesson in that. Many truths are relational. They gain depth by being seen in connection. A tomb is understood through the landscape around it. A god is understood through ritual, text, image, and local practice. A dynasty is understood through what came before and after. A fragment of pottery means more once placed beside other fragments. Even sleep, in some way, comes through relationship with the surrounding quiet. One settles not into blankness, but into a field of calmer rhythms. The breathing slows. The body remembers gravity. The mind, at last, ceases to arrange the world so insistently. The ancient Egyptians would perhaps recognize the value of such settling. Their funerary traditions were in part a way of helping the deceased settle into the next mode of existence. Their rituals were transitions softened by words and objects and repeated acts. Their gods, too, often represented transitions: dawn into day, life into death, flood into field, chaos into order. The world was not seen as fixed, but as something that needed continual tending. Order was maintained, not assumed. That is one reason Mat, the principle of balance, truth, and rightness, feels so central. It is not a loud concept. It is a steady one. It asks for attention, proportion, and care. Mad is beautiful in part because it is so calm. It suggests that the proper arrangement of the world is not necessarily dramatic. It is measured. It is the river in its banks, the scale held even, the words spoken truthfully, the offering made with sincerity, the day lived without unnecessary violence. In an ancient society subject to drought, flood, political strain, and mortality, such a principle would have been deeply reassuring. It is not hard to understand why it became so important. People need a way to imagine that the world, despite its disruptions, can still be held in balance. And when balance is threatened, Egyptian myth often presents the struggle in symbolic form. Disorder takes a name. The sun must journey through darkness. The rightful king must be confirmed. The dead must be defended from threats in the unseen realm. Chaos is real, but so is the response to it. Protective words, ritual actions, and divine help can all stand against uncertainty. Again and again, the stories return to the same soft but persistent hope. Things may be endangered, but they are not abandoned. That may be why so many tomb scenes are rich with offerings and abundance. They do not deny hardship. They answer it with image. Bread, beer, oxen, birds, fruit, fish, flowers, jars of oil, baskets of grain. The painted world becomes generous where the living world may have been precarious. It is a kind of visual assurance, a promise that sustenance can continue in another form. The tomb wall becomes a quiet pantry of memory. The deceased is not left hungry in the imagination. There is care enough to go on. And care also appears in the way modern people continue to study and preserve these remains. Conservation is a subtle art. Pigments are stabilized. Wall paintings are shielded from moisture. Wood is supported. Fragile textiles are stored in controlled conditions. In museums, curators and conservators work to keep what the desert and time have already so delicately preserved. This is another layer of guardianship, one that links present and past. The old tomb may be sealed no longer, but its contents can still be treated with reverence. The task is not to conquer the past, but to keep it legible without harming it. Sometimes that requires restraint, which is its own quiet virtue. Not every artifact needs to be displayed. Not every chamber should be entered. Not every mystery must be forced into certainty. There is dignity in allowing some spaces to remain dim, especially when their survival depends on that dimness. Ancient Egypt, perhaps more than many places, teaches the value of threshold and boundary. Doors mattered. Seals mattered. Hidden places mattered. To know that something existed behind a stone wall could be enough. The imagination could rest there. There are, of course, famous moments of discovery that captured the world's attention, such as the opening of Tutankhamun's tomb, with its remarkable preservation and layered burial goods. But even there, the fascination did not come only from treasure. It came from the sense of intimacy. The chamber held the belongings of a young king whose world had been sealed away, then returned to view after a very long sleep. The objects seemed to wait. The gold gleamed, but the deeper pull was the human presence behind it all. A bed, a chest, jewelry, sandals, vessels, statues, masks. The room felt inhabited by absence and memory at once. That sensation may be why people continue to love Egyptian stories. They are full of grandeur, but also of nearness. A royal burial can feel as personal as a family chamber because both are organized around the same simple concern: how to keep someone known. The scale changes, the materials differ, but the emotional grammar is shared. This makes the civilization easy to revisit in quiet moments. One can dwell on a single scarab, a single painted eye, a single line of hieroglyphs, and feel the whole vast world around it. Hieroglyphs themselves are among the most enchanting of human inventions. They are not merely symbols in the abstract. They are images that speak. A bird, a reed, a hand, a loaf, an eye, a sky, a river, a seated figure. Writing becomes a kind of visual music, arranged by convention and meaning. To learn to read it is to enter a patient relationship with form and sound. Even when the script was used in administrative documents or labels, it retained a ceremonial beauty. The written word in Egypt often felt worthy of carving into stone because writing itself was treated as a powerful act. The god Thoth, often associated with writing, would be a fitting companion to these reflections. He embodies intellect without noise, wisdom without haste. The scribe's desk, the calendar, the accounting board, the ritual text, the measured utterance all belong to his domain. In a way, Thoth represents the quiet architecture of civilization itself, the invisible order that makes memory possible. Without writing, much would have vanished. With it, fragments remain. Not everything, but enough to dream upon. Dreaming itself mattered in ancient Egypt. Sleep could be a place of messages, omens, and divine contact. A dream was not necessarily random. It might carry significance, direction, warning, or comfort. In a world where the boundary between visible and invisible was porous, dream life had its place in the larger order. It makes sense, then, that a bedtime narration about Egypt can feel especially appropriate. We are already at the threshold where ordinary thought loosens. The ancient Egyptians knew thresholds well. Their world was full of them. Between day and night, life and death, home and temple, land and river, order and chaos, human and divine. Standing at a threshold is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is as simple as pausing in a doorway and noticing the cooler air beyond. Ancient Egyptian architecture often magnified such thresholds into meaningful transitions. Courtyards led to halls, which led to sanctuaries. Corridors narrowed. Light changed. Sound softened. The body became aware of passing from public to private, from visible to restricted, from outer to inner. Tombs, too, were threshold spaces. They led from sunlit rock into enclosed chambers where images and words continued a different kind of life. To move through them, even in imagination, is to feel how carefully the Egyptians staged transition. Even the desert itself serves as a threshold. It separates inhabited land from the vastness beyond. It preserves what is buried in it. It frames the living river valley like a protective edge. And because it is so dry, it becomes a natural keeper of the past. Textiles survive. Wood survives more often than it would in damp climates. Skin, seeds, sandals, baskets, and papyrus can endure in astonishing condition. The desert is harsh in one sense, but merciful in another. It does not let the dead fully return to dust. It holds them in a suspended half-silence, which is one reason archaeology in Egypt often feels like listening to a voice that has been preserved by climate as much as by human intention. That preserved silence is not empty. It is rich with the ordinary. A comb, a coal pot, a piece of bread, a toy, a loaf stamp, a cosmetic spoon, a linen strip, a tool handle, a damaged statue head, a humble offering bowl. These objects tell stories without urgency. They suggest hands and habits, not just events. They remind us that ancient Egypt was made of everyday care. The famous monuments would have been impossible without people who lived ordinary lives under the same sun. Perhaps the deepest comfort in all this is the recognition that human beings have always done much the same kinds of things with great seriousness. We have marked our loved ones. We have built shelters. We have made offerings. We have tried to understand the sky. We have observed animals. We have feared the unknown and tried to name it. We have buried our dead with care. We have sought order amid change. Ancient Egypt, then, is not only a lost world. It is also a mirror with soft edges, showing old versions of concerns that remain familiar. And so the night can keep drifting through those old concerns gently. A temple bell is not ringing. But in the mind, there is an imagined hush where one might think of priests pouring water, presenting incense, and speaking words that ask the gods to remain attentive. A tomb is not opening, but one can picture the painted corridor gleaming faintly by torchlight. A boat is not crossing the river, but the water is there in memory, dark and steady. A star is not falling, but the sky is full of ancient positions, many of them named and watched for thousands of years. The past persists in such soft details. There were times in Egyptian history when foreign rulers wore local crowns, adopted local titles, and entered local sacred structures. There were periods of political fragmentation and reunification, of artistic refinement and political tension, of economic growth and instability. Yet even these disruptions did not erase the broader continuity. Instead, they added layers. Egypt accumulated history without losing its fundamental shape. That accumulation can be thought of like sediment in the river basin, each year adding a little more fertility, a little more depth. Civilizations, like landscapes, are formed through slow deposition. And because of that layering, the later periods of Egypt are often especially interesting. Greek, Roman, and local Egyptian traditions interwove in ways that produced new forms of art, religion, and scholarship. Temples continued to operate for centuries under changing political conditions. Egyptian gods were identified with others, local cults adapted, and old forms persisted in new contexts. Alexandria became a place of learning and mingling traditions. Egyptian knowledge traveled into wider Mediterranean worlds. The civilization was never sealed off from history. It participated in it, quietly and continuously. Even after the ancient temples were no longer active, the land retained its associations. Pilgrims, travelers, scholars, and dreamers kept returning to Egypt in imagination. The ruins became part of the world's memory. The stones continued to stand. The statues lost heads, but not presence. The inscriptions weathered but did not disappear. Every generation has looked at Egypt and found in it something both distant and familiar. That is perhaps the final quiet magic of the place. It can be remote enough to inspire wonder and human enough to invite tenderness. A bedtime story does not need to resolve all of that. It only needs to wander softly among it, to follow the line of a temple wall, to rest beside a sarcophagus lid, to imagine the cool interior of a burial chamber, to notice the painted stars overhead, to hear perhaps the faint rustle of papyrus pages, to sit in the shade of a fig tree while the river moves far below, to let a god pass by in bird form or seated calm, to let a name be spoken once more and then fade into quiet, to understand, if only for a moment, that history is not only what happened, it is also what is remembered gently. And so the narration can remain slow, like a boat drifting into evening. The river darkens. The banks soften, the temples recede, the desert cools. The tombs become stars in the mind, each one a small chamber of preserved time. The gods do not hurry. They are not required to. In the old Egyptian imagination, eternal things move with dignity, and the soul finds rest not by racing forward, but by aligning with that dignity. A steady breath, a settled room, a quiet body, a mind with enough space to wander and then return. Sleep is near. It may arrive the way the Nile arrives at dusk, not with announcement, but with a gradual deepening. The sounds of the day thin out. The last light on stone turns amber, then gray-blue. A bird settles in a palm. A lantern is lit somewhere out of sight. A voice lowers. A thought slows. Ancient Egypt remains in the background, serene and layered, a civilization of tombs and temples, of gods and names, of hidden chambers and open skies. It continues to keep its watch, but the watch is gentle. And when the eyes finally close, there is still the sense of a long and patient land continuing beyond them. The river in its course, the stars in their places, the sealed rooms under the sand. the painted figures with their calm expressions, the small amulets awaiting touch, the gods of sky, soil, sun, and silence, the people who once lived, worked, loved, and hoped beneath the same wide heavens. Their world does not ask to be solved tonight. It only asks to be remembered softly. So let the memory linger without strain. Let the quiet gods remain in their serene forms. Let the hidden tomb stories rest in the earth, guarded by time and desert and care. Let the long history of Egypt fold gently into the night, not as an ending, but as a calm continuation. And may the sleep that follows be as steady as stone, as soft as linen, as patient as the river, and as peaceful as a star seen from far away.